So we just wrapped up the IMF and World Bank spring meetings last week. I think it was a productive week for BWC. I think it was also a productive week for the institutions. And as we come out of the week and the dust settles on kind of what was a busy week, I just wanted to talk through kind of what our three takeaways were from it.
Yeah, I've been attending these meetings now for over a decade, and this is probably the most consequential set of meetings that I can remember in my history. But I left really encouraged by some of the signals that we saw. So I think takeaway number one is, the IMF and World Bank can still be forums for global progress. We saw the WEO come out and the managing director speak to reducing uncertainty. So it really could have been a moment where we weren't sure how countries were going to come to these meetings and respond, but they did.
Mm-hmm.
The 190
Yeah.
countries came, maybe not all, but a majority of them sent delegations, and they really constructively approached the week.
Yeah, I think, as you say, I think we saw the IMFC meetings, the Development Committee meeting, even the G20 meeting. Everyone kind of approached with how do we engage constructively? What are our positive next steps here? And to your point on everyone sending a delegation, I think the convening power of the institutions even goes a little bit further than the official meetings. We saw a lot of countries take this as an opportunity to start on bilateral trade talks. We know Secretary Bessent met with, I think, 11 countries at least, delegations from 11 countries, and the EU commissioner. And so I agree. I think this shows, like you said, the IMF and the World Bank are still very much kind of the trusted forums for global problem solving right now. But that wasn't the only open question going into the week. There was also kind of this really big question on how the U.S. would engage this week.
Yeah, that's right. I think everybody was kind of looking to see if the U.S. was going to send any signals on what its intent was towards the IMF and World Bank as it is undergoing this review of its participation in all international organizations, and we've already seen it withdraw from some multilateral institutions. So there was a lot of concern about whether or not the U.S. was in fact going to remain in these institutions. And I think my biggest takeaway from the week was we saw very strong signals from the U.S. of their intent to remain committed to strong U.S. leadership in these institutions. The newly appointed chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, Congressman French Hill, spoke at our BWC summit, gave a pretty full-throated support for the IMF and World Bank. Although he has a very robust reform agenda for these institutions and wants to make sure that they are sticking to their comparative advantages, that there is not mission creep at the institutions, and that they're really delivering on the mandates that they were designed for. We heard that same commitment from Secretary Bessent as well. So it was really encouraging to see them both kind of singing from the same songbook. And I think Secretary Bessent gave a really forward-leaning kind of speech about his intent and the Trump administration's intent to remain in these institutions, and to not only remain, but to really implement really strong U.S. leadership in the institutions. And he outlined kind of the starting point of his reform agenda, which I think echoed what French Hill's agenda was in terms of kind of this back to basics approach, right? So for the IMF, that really means accountability, stronger accountability. I think really calling out countries for irresponsible fiscal policy, currency manipulation, protracted and continued borrowing from the institution, right? And for the World Bank, I think both Congressman Hill as well as Secretary Bessent have been really wanting them to focus on development impact and outcomes, and what they both have been concerned about is their energy financing policy. And I think we're going to see some movement now from the bank on maybe reviewing its energy financing policy and including kind of an all-of-the-above energy mix. So I was really encouraged to see strong signals from both of those really influential U.S. leaders, both in the administration and in Congress, coming out of this week.
Yeah, that mission creep quote from Bessent really does jump out. he went back to it time and time again. And I think to that point, though, the institutions did their part as well this week. I mean, they put their core mandates front and center, kind of in numerous ways. We saw it both in the lead up to the meetings with some of the speeches from the managing director, the op-ed from President Bonga, and I think the announcements that came out of this week, or of last week, sorry, were very much aligned with that. I think we saw from the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, we saw the debt restructuring playbook that's aimed at kind of shortening the restructuring timelines, and that's been an area where progress has been far too slow, really. And so while the playbook is kind of an intermediate step forward, maybe it doesn't solve all of the thornier issues. Hopefully it can kind of be the beginning of some momentum there.
Yeah, something BWC is really happy to see.
Yes, something BWC's been talking about for a long time.
Working on for a long time, that's right.
But we also saw on the IMF side, I mean, the managing director at BWC's event on Tuesday addressed the serial borrower problem pretty head on. I mean, she cited Argentina, Pakistan, Egypt as countries that the IMF really does need to, kind of as you were saying, that Secretary Besant said, needs to make sure they're enacting real reforms, getting to the next phase of growth, so that it's not just borrowing into perpetuity.
Yep.
On the bank side, we saw we're expecting President Bonga to take the new energy financing proposal to the board in June, I think. And that will kind of ease back some of the restrictions on nuclear financing, take what's been being called for, I think, for a long time, more of a holistic energy approach to put energy security front and center, and not necessarily let it be sidelined or a secondary goal. And then really the big thing on the bank side that I was looking out for last week is some movement on private sector investment.
Yep.
It's been talked about for as long as I've been at BWC. It's been talked about, I'm sure, much before.
As long as I've been at BWC.
And I think this next phase of the private sector investment lab gets us a little bit closer. I mean, they're moving to the implementation phase. They've got their kind of 5 pillars that they're centered around. They have securitization as part of that. That's been, again, a long talked about, very little actioned on item.
Asset classes, the holy grail.
But I think it's been talked about so much because it has that potential to be really catalytic to kind of that next step of really getting private sector investment, into the growth space.
Yeah, so I think we saw some really good movement last week from both the U.S. and from the IMF and World Bank, and other shareholders besides the U.S. So there was really strong signals sent. I think it was a really positive week in terms of forward momentum. But there's, we still need to see a little bit more progress going forward. So there's a couple of things that I'm going to be, I think, looking out for. So first, from the U.S., in terms of its real intent for leadership in the IMF and World Bank, strong signals this week, really positive and encouraging. But I think what we'll see next, or what we can look towards, is first the president's budget request. We're expecting that out. The skinny budget version of that should be out in the next couple of weeks, and then that'll be followed by the fuller version of that. And that is just the president's budget request to Congress, right? But if there's funding in there for IDA, if there's funding in there for the IMF quota package that has been negotiated, I think those will be signals of that there is real, true U.S. intent and the administration's intent to really support these institutions. Now, even if those aren't in there, Congress can go ahead and move forward with authorizing those funds and appropriating those funds. So we should also look at the congressional budget process for some signals as well. And then the executive order that we were discussing in terms of the U.S.'s review of its participation in all international organizations, that's set to conclude in August. So that'll really be our definitive answer, right, of kind of the U.S.'s intent. I mean, all signals from this week are that kind of withdrawal from the bank and fund are off the table now, barring any unexpected surprises. But we'll kind of get that definitive answer in August. So I think then from, the institution side, kind of what are we looking for going forward on some of these reform agenda issues and some of the priorities that they outlined this week. So, I mean, I think for the bank, you have, you already said, the board is expected to vote in June on Banga's proposal on the energy financing policy. So that's been a bit contentious up until this point. There's been some holdouts on some people countries who really don't think that nuclear in particular should be on the table. So now with kind of full U.S. support behind nuclear, I think we'll see if some of those holdouts will end up voting that policy through. And then I'm really also going to be looking for signals from the bank to really kind of address this graduation issue. I mean, it's mostly the criticism has mostly been, countries need to graduate from IBRD concessional financing, especially if they're very large economies that don't really meet the terms any longer for concessional financing. They need to move on and free up those funds for countries that need them. But there is this kind of counter argument of the reflows, and that the bank actually really needs the reflows from those countries, right, to finance to finance their other projects. So I'm kind of interested to see how that debate is actually going to shape up. It's been discussed for a long time, but it's now in focus again, and we've got to find a way to move that forward. And we know now it's a U.S. priority as well. On the IMF side, I'm going to be looking for real progress on the serial borrowers issue. Again, long discussed, no real movement, and it's a tricky one. One. The IMF is designed to support countries that need support, but they also need to be tough in terms of making sure that those countries are actually enacting reforms before they just continue to give them new programs into perpetuity. So I'd like to see some type of IEO review on this issue, maybe some new staff guidance, but I'd like to see something tangible that they're really trying to think through this issue at this point in time. And then, as you mentioned, on the debt piece, I mean, progress far too slow. This is a tangible outcome for us to point to, but really the stickier issues of transparency and burden sharing really remain. And if the macro environment does stay more difficult, more countries are going to need debt restructuring more quickly. So there's really sort of renewed impetus, I think, to move that forward.
Certainly feels like a bit of a ticking clock there.
Yeah. So I think, bottom line, productive spring meetings, some positive signals all around, and now let's see what happens in October.